This is episode 10 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, I'm Ben Crystal, actor, author, and explorer of original practices in Shakespeare. And another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
A lot of the excavated leather in the past is black because it was treated with all sorts of tanning materials and oils, and it's very rigid and brittle. But the new techniques mean that not only do we have the shape of the shoe, but sometimes also the impression of the foot within it.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When you study the history of Shakespeare, you'll know that it's very rare to find actual artifacts from his time period that you can definitely date to being within Shakespeare's time period. And it's even more rare to find artifacts that are attributed to actual actors on the Shakespearean stage. And yet, that is exactly what the Museum of London had on display in 2009. And with us today is Hazel Forsyth, the senior curator of the medieval and post-medieval collections at the Museum of London, to talk with us about a pair of shoes, actually 6 different shoes, which were discovered at the site of the Rose Theatre and were thought to be worn by Shakespearean actors at that theatre. This remarkable find is allowing archaeologists and historians to piece together some of the history of Shakespeare's time period. And Hazel Forsyth is here to discuss it with us today. Hazel Forsyth is senior curator of the medieval and post-medieval collections at the Museum of London and curator of the Cheapside Hoard, which is the largest collection of Elizabethan and Stuart jewelry in the world. She's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a freeman of the City of London, a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, and a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Pewterers. So she knows a lot about historical artifacts that date back to Elizabethan England and to Shakespeare's lifetime, which is what we're going to talk with her about today. She joins us today to discuss a display that the Museum of London had in 2009 of a small case of shoes which were apparently worn by Shakespearean actors. Now, that question is up for grabs, and she's here to sort of set the record straight about whether or not those actors really did wear the specific set of shoes that they found. Now, what makes them date to Shakespeare's lifetime is something Hazel will discuss with us today, and she's going to share with us why finding shoes in the site of the old Rose Theatre doesn't necessarily mean they were worn by Shakespearean actors. This remarkable find is allowing archaeologists and historians to piece together some of the history of Shakespeare's time period, which remains so elusive to those of us who love the bard. Hazel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
This exhibit was on display back in 2009 at the Museum of London Docklands, but when was it actually discovered?
It was discovered during an archaeological excavation conducted by the Museum of London Archaeological Service in the 1990s.
Where did they find it?
Well, it was found on the site of the Playhouse, the Rose, one of Shakespeare's playhouses on Bankside in Southwark.
So explain for those of us that are not familiar with London and the surrounding areas, what's that near?
Well, if you're looking at a map of London, London in the 16th century at least comprised 3 distinct urban centres: the City of London, the intramural area, which we would now call the Square Mile, the commercial mercantile centre, and immediately opposite that, on the south bank of the River Thames, is Southwark, which already by the 16th century had 10% of the urban population. And then further to the west, a distinct urban centre, the town of Westminster, which was the seat of government. And the City of London and the city or town of Westminster were linked by a linear settlement stretching stretching along the north bank of the Thames, the area that is now known today as the Strand and Fleet Street.
Is that why archaeologists were looking at these sites? I mean, why were they doing the dig here in the first place?
From time to time, developers have access to a new site, and by legal requirement, archaeologists have an opportunity to assess that site for archaeological potential. They may not actually undertake a full excavation, but of course, if the opportunity arises, and if the site is an important one like this, then there will be an opportunity for them to dig. And of course, we don't really know when we start the work what we'll find. The problem for post-medieval archaeology in London is fairly acute because almost all of the important post-medieval layers have been destroyed by Victorian building foundations or damaged during the Second World War. So what survives typically survives in very isolated pockets, either in a cesspit or a well, or beyond the really built-up urban spaces of London, the periphery, in other words. And Southwark has produced quite a number of important archaeological sites for post-medieval.
Were they expecting to find old shoes? I mean, what were they looking for?
Well, no, the simple answer to that. When the excavation begins, nobody knows what they're going to find, and it's often unusual, actually, to find any material at all, particularly organic materials, which don't survive in the ground particularly well. And in this particular site, they've survived in a very fragmentary state, only because the material was sufficiently damp and secured or deposited within what we would call an anaerobic environment. In other words, the oxygen's excluded and it's fairly damp. So organic material, particularly wood, bone and leather, survives to some extent. And we've got a few fragmentary pieces, fragmentary only. So it's difficult to know how representative, of course, this material is. It's just what survived and what was recovered during that particular excavation.
Which is really surprising because, and this is an amateur question in terms of archaeology, but it's surprising to me to think that the dampness would actually aid in its preservation. You'd think between things like mold and other kinds of damp-related deterrents that actually the dampness would be something that harmed it. Was it, buried in the ground and so it created like this cocoon that just preserved the material? 400 years is a long time for it to still be in good condition.
Yes, and essentially it is the combination of the exclusion of oxygen, which would accelerate fungal growth and bacteriological degradation, the dampness combined, which has ensured preservation. The other important factor to consider is that there are new techniques in conservation which ensure a much better quality of preservation of organic materials. So we use a technique of freeze-drying the leather and impregnating the leather with polyethylene glycol, which is essentially a polymer-based substance which allows the leather almost to breathe as it would naturally. So it retains its subtlety and texture and to some extent colour. A lot of the excavated leather in the past is black because it was treated with all sorts of tanning materials and oils, and it's very rigid and brittle. But the new techniques mean that not only do we have the shape of the shoe, but sometimes also the impression of the foot within it. So you can sometimes see that shoes have been slashed or the person has got some problem with their foot or toe, which is quite marked and appears in almost as an imprint on the upper or on the sole of the shoe. And you can also see some decorative details which otherwise would be lost. So in this particular instance, the shoe that you're referring to has a sole and a vamp, the upper part of the shoe, and quarters, the back or heel part of the shoe. You can see the lines of stitching. Mostly the stitching has gone, but you can see a line along the upper near the toe where the shoe has been deliberately incised with a pattern. And then again, a sort of chevron design around the heel.
And those were put there. You can tell what kind of issue or foot problem they were having. Was that a design thing that they cut a hole in the shoe, or was it because the person wearing them had some kind of foot ailment?
Well, the two features that I've mentioned, the line of incisions along the surface of the upper and around the heel, are purely decorative. But there is also a small hole at the toe of the shoe which is possibly wear. So perhaps somebody had a prominent toe and it just poked its way through the shoe. But also, of course, being at the toe end, the shoes will scuff as they do today, and people drag their feet along the ground. So it could be damage caused through just general wear and tear. But it could also have been damage subsequent to burial and recovery.
Well, I know with this set of shoes that you found, part of the remarkableness of finding old shoes is that these were thought to have been used by actors at the Rose Theatre during Shakespeare's lifetime. And I wonder if you can explain how you concluded that. How do we know that they were actors' shoes?
Well, we don't. It's a simple and truthful answer. So we have absolutely no way of knowing whether whether the footwear from the site was discarded material from the actors or there for some other reason. It's supposition that the shoes and boot fragments belong to the acting community, but they may well not have been. I mean, it's difficult to imagine people losing their shoes and not coming back for them, quite frankly, but these archaeological sites are subject to all sorts of intrusion, so it's entirely possible that the shoe was there. I mean, it could have been a prop. That's another interpretation, that it was just an old pair of shoes that somebody discarded and, was just part of the sort of contamination on the site.
Well, in an article for Culture 24 magazine, Alex Hopkins wrote that the shoe was believed to have been worn during an actual performance on the 16th century theatrical stage. Is that the way the Museum of London displayed it when they did their exhibit in 2009?
I didn't actually see that display, but I'd be surprised if it was quite so overtly stated, because we simply don't have the evidence to support that supposition, really.
Right, to say that for sure.
I mean, it was recovered from an unstratified context, and I simply don't know how you could possibly say that it was worn by an actor.
Well, that is good to hear, because I was confused by that. Personally, I thought that was a strong conclusion to make, but I don't know. I believe in the power of archaeology and people who know more than I do about history, so I was thinking, wow, there's got to be something that they found that makes that pretty likely. But it sounds like that conclusion is sort of a guess based on where it was found, as opposed to anything about the shoe specifically. Is that right?
Yes, and I think you couldn't even say anything about the shoe specifically, because how would that shoe vary? You can't say that just because the shoe is found on the site and it's this particular style of shoe, that it's a shoe worn by an actor, because it's just an ordinary standard shoe of the period. There's nothing remarkable about it in terms of its fashionable design. It's not in any way atypical for the period, and with many other examples from across London.
So it does actually date to within Shakespeare's lifetime. So even if it's not actually from the Rose Theatre, and it does represent the kind of shoe that was worn during the time period?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's found in the vicinity of the Rose Theatre, but it is a generic type of shoe of the period. I mean, it could have been lost by workmen, for example. There are all sorts of possibilities about why the shoe's there.
Well, I think with so little to know about Shakespeare's time period in terms of things you can, put your hands on or see at a museum, that's kind of an exciting idea to think that this is from that time period in an unrecreated sort of way. But the display that the Museum of London Docklands did put on was said to have included hazelnut shells. Why are hazelnut shells an authentic part of theatre life in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, I always describe them as a sort of Tudor popcorn. And again, we don't really know why so many hazelnut shells were found on the site, but it seems that they were mixed in with the clinker, the sort of rough surfacing used on the floor of the auditorium, which was, of course, open to the elements. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is, and this is my interpretation, the poet Thomas Haywood describes theatre audiences chomping up and down on nuts, and as he put it, up and under jaw work. So you imagine this sort of munching going on through the performance, hence my association with a kind of Tudor popcorn. And so with every performance, you've got 1,000 people on average, you would get an accumulation of byproduct. You'd get the shells falling down onto the floor. But the other more prosaic interpretation is that the clinker used as the surfacing material was a byproduct of local soap manufacturing and the shell material used for soap manufacture, and the two mixed together and then simply dumped because it was a convenient byproduct used to floor the theatre. So we really don't know.
Okay. So it was found near a theater, and it was found with hazelnut shells that were eaten at a theater, but all of these are just, they could be coincidental as opposed to evidence for it being from the theater. Are there aspects of footwear for actors in this time period that match the shoes that you found?
No. I mean, Henslow's papers refer to shoes, but of course there's no specific description of the kinds of shoes, and they would simply have worn for particular performances. They may have opted for, let's just say, somewhat unusual wear, depending on the role that they were performing at the time.
Still, it's a remarkable find to have shoes from that long ago to see, and to think that it was from Shakespeare's time period is very exciting. I do have some questions not directly related to Shakespeare, but before I jump into those, are there any other facts about these shoes or about other artifacts on display at the Museum of London which we should know about?
Response to my comment about the hazelnut shells, because I think it is important to say they were found on the theatre site, and they were mixed with the clinker on the base of the auditorium, and the components of floor strongly suggest, I think, that it's a waste byproduct from the soap bottle of the yard nearby, because nut oil is boiled together with wood ash or soda for the manufacture of soap, and it's a logical step to assume that the two go hand in hand. But some of the playgoers, we know from other contemporary evidence, ate fruit and nuts, and so it is entirely possible also that some of that product of nut evidence comes from consumption of nuts during the performance.
So it could go either way.
Yeah, absolutely. We have quite an extraordinary collection of items from the theatre site. Ceramics, a little bit of a wooden baluster from the gallery, and also a rather intriguing number of fragments of ceramic money pots. And these are intriguing because the money, one assumes from the playgoers, was collected in these pots, but the only way that you could extract the money was to break the pot. And so what we have archaeologically is the evidence of that breakage, tiny little, they're rather like knobs at the top of the pot, just above the vertical slot. And those have survived in very large numbers. And it is a bit of a curiosity that they seem to have collected the sieve in a ceramic form rather than in a leather purse. They may have done both things, of course, but we do seem to have a rather large number of these ceramic sherds from money pots.
And you said a piece of the gallery of the theatre?
It's, yes, a baluster rail, a wooden baluster rail from the theatre.
Oh, fascinating. And all of those, are they currently on display at the museum, or these are part of the archives there?
Those items are actually on display. And we also have a ring from the theatre site as well, and a part of a rosary. The ring is particularly interesting because it's inscribed in French on the outside of the hoop or shank, basically saying, think of me. So perhaps a loss from a playgoer or an actor. Again, we don't really know.
And I guess we should clarify, when we're saying the baluster from the theater, you're talking about the same Rose Theater site that the
Yes,
shoes were found? Yeah.
Absolutely, yes. This is all from the Rose Theatre.
Well, think about the books that you've read in the last couple of years. What would you say are one or two titles that immediately come to mind as having had the biggest impact on you?
Well, this is really difficult because I don't tend to read. Are you thinking of historical books particularly? I
Yes.
assume you are. Because I tend not to read secondary source material very much at all, and I focus much more on manuscript sources.
It's really a fun question I like to ask when I have guests on the podcast, because I'm convinced that reading plays a big role in life and success at it. And so I'm really just interested in what books you've been reading. It can be related to history, but it doesn't have to be.
Because I find that really difficult because I flick read various things every day. So I can't really think of any.
Okay, there's no go-to manual that you
because
keep
as a
on your desk?
curator. Well, no, because as a curator, my subject area is huge. I cover everything from AD 410 to 1714. So I'm flitting from one subject, an object category to another the whole time. My actual specialism is metalwork and jewellery. So I tend to sort of look at a lot of articles, perhaps more than technical articles and things, perhaps more than books. Otherwise, London is so full of fabulous archives. So most of what I do is primary research on contemporary documents.
Which sounds like a fascinating way to spend time. I believe that the study of history is essential to the study of Shakespeare's plays. What are some of your tips for learning the history of someone like William Shakespeare?
It certainly does help to have an understanding of the context and the period in which he lived. And I think that's very important. So thankfully for London, and for the period generally, there is an enormous body of evidence, both in printed book form and in manuscript, as well as, of course, artifactual survival. I think in terms of contemporary works, one of the most engaging is the Survey of London, which was first published by John Stowe, an antiquarian, in 1598, and he went on a sort of extended perambulation around the city, recording specific sites, monuments, church effigies, and key buildings. It's slightly frustrating for the modern historian because what he omits completely are the kind of nitty-gritty facts and details that one might really much rather have about trade and commerce and workshop practices and so on. And for that, really there is a gap in evidence, and one has to turn then to inventories and archival sources. Also for London, we're very, very fortunate here at the museum in having one of the most important documents of the city, which is a map form that we have what is known as a copper plate map of London, which survives only in its plate form. No printed edition of the map survives, but it's the plates that survive, and there are 3 of them, 2 in our collection, 1 in Germany, show the central part of the city, and it provides the first bird's eye view of London. It's of enormous topographical importance, and it dates to about 1558-59. And from that, you can see the really built-up intramural space, the congestion of the urban centre, and then just beyond the walls, the suburban sprawl and spread, but also just how rural London was. So people like Stowe, for example, explain that as a boy he was sent to fetch the morning milk. He went to the Minories, the area by the Tower of London, to collect milk, which is about a mile. And there were cows, of course, and pasturage all around London. And that sort of relationship between the very urban space and the rural space is very important when you think of Shakespeare living in London at the time. And also the river, and you can't really think about London without thinking about the Thames. And this copper plate map of London shows the royal barge and other vessels, but particularly the royal barge being rowed upstream. And I like to think of Shakespeare sort of sucking his quill pen for inspiration and then seeing the royal barge come into view, which would have been a familiar sight to him with its perfume cells and musicians, and then using that as a way of inspiring him to write about Antony and or Cleopatra's barge in the play Antony and Cleopatra. So I think a lot of the physicality of London, its topography, its smells, and the sights of the city are fed into Shakespeare's plays. And if you have a better understanding of that, then a lot of the meaning in the plays suddenly has a little bit more poignancy and reality, because you can understand behind the text what he was actually describing. And what playgoers at the time was instantly picked up on, which we now, 400 years later, struggle to understand, but it has that kind of nuance that contemporary audiences would have immediately connected with.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
My own research is focused on the Cheapside Hoard, which is the world's largest collection of Elizabethan and Jacobean jewellery, and our new museum, which we're actively planning. So the whole museum is moving to a new site, and as part of that, the Cheapside Hoard will have a permanent designated gallery. So I want to do more research on it, and that's one of my sort of key objectives over the next few years.
That is fascinating, and I am excited to know that. We will definitely link over to the Museum of London so we can keep tabs on the new location and check out that exhibit. Hazel Forsyth, thank you so much for joining me for today's interview. It's been a joy speaking with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.